afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm very glad to see that the rain at least has stopped, although we still are very gray for a spring day in Chicago. My name is Susan Burns, and I'm the director of the Center for East Asian Studies, which sponsors this lecture series. This is the fourth lecture, and I believe the second one on Korea this year. And in a moment, I'll invite my colleague, Kyung-hee Chae, to introduce the speaker, Professor Kwon. But I did want to say just a few words about the series itself. A couple of years ago, we started the Center for East Asian Studies lecture series with the aim of bringing scholars from the U.S. and from Asia and Europe who are working on timely topics to give a talk and participate in a Q&A about their work. And it's been a great opportunity, in this case for people who work on Korea, to hear a distinguished professor speak about her work, but it's also been a great opportunity for those of us who work on other fields. I actually work on Japan, but I have a healthy interest in the colonial period, needless to say. So it's wonderful to see such a great turnout. And I also want to ask you to pick up one of the schedules on the way out of the other activities that are going on, sponsored by our center. There's one more talk in our series, which will be on May 30th. And Professor Ratnam Selinger of Bowdoin University will be talking on War Without Blood, the Curious Itinerary of a Taboo Fluid in Medieval Japan. And then we also have two workshops coming up in the next couple of weeks, one on reading early Chinese text, and then there's one that I'm actually organizing called Vernacular Medicine in Modern Japan. So a little bit of publicity. So now I'll introduce Kyung-hee Chae, Professor of Korean Literature from East Asian Languages and Civilization.
I want to really profusely thank our colleagues in the East Asian Studies, Center for East Asian Studies for supporting all this work. And it is a great delight and privilege for me to introduce you to Professor Boduerae, who will deliver today's CEAS lecture, and also her counterpart for the post-lecture conversation, Professor Hosam Aboul-Ela. I cannot pronounce Arabic. So I got to know Professor Boduerae 2010 when I was participating in a conference at UC Irvine. At that time, the conference title was Korean Popular Culture Workshop. And this is before the truncated K-pop kind of like K-drama thing. So people and popular were still very seriously kind of discussed at that time. And almost 10 years passed, and she recently, this winter, published a more than 645-page long book called The Night Will March First, subtitled A Dream of Peace Dreamt in the Age of Violence. And I think that part of the lecture might be related to that book. And Professor Kwon is currently a professor of Korean literature at Korea University in Korea. So 2 days ago, she gave the keynote speech at the conference titled Counter Readings, Modern Asian Literary Histories. And there, when one of the conference organizers, David Krolikoski there, formally introduced her to her prior to a speech. First and foremost noted that the overwhelming scope and scale of her work, which David characterized as quote-unquote defying summarization. And I myself find that the whole spectrum of her work to truly defy any attempt to be accounted for synoptically. I think that among the reasons why we could not quite easily capture her work is that she not only has published many results of her own single-handed individual research, but also has played a very distinctively collaborative and facilitating role in setting up the research agenda for numerous scholarly projects in South Korea as main organizer, co-organizer, or co-author in the past 2 decades. Her first 2 single-authored book publications, The Origin of Modern Korean Fiction, 2000, whose revised edition just came out 2012, and another book, The Age of Romance, subtitled The Culture and Trends of the 1920s, which was published in 2003 and in Japanese translation in 2013, are now the must-readings for any serious scholar of Korean history and culture of the colonial era. And her third and fourth single-authored books, such as Reading the Age of Rumor, subtitled Mail-Shinbo, newspaper of the government journal's organ, and the 1910s Korea, 2008, and Shinsoseol, New Fiction in Korea, subtitled Its Language and Politics, 2014. These 2 books represent the finest empirical scholarship within Korean literary studies and have irrevocably catalyzed the expansion of the very horizon of Korean literary studies, which have been characterized often very narrowly defined. But one of the most irrevocable contributions she has made to the field, and probably its future in the coming years, has come through her empowering role in leading, facilitating, and enabling a series of collective endeavors. And so any serious student of Korea, in and out of Korea, is likely to have noticed that many key publications in the field has Professor Kwon's name as editor and contributors. According to Ji-young Park here, our Korean language collection librarian, the Korean language books she authored or co-authored amount to 32 publications, and our collection is 21. Of course, her articles in various journals have formed its own category. I should note that a good number of them are ones that really have moved South Korean study, the literary and other cultural studies, toward cultural studies, which singularly blends at once meticulous and exhaustive readings of magazines and newspapers into cultural, historical, and theoretical scholarship. To name a few, the 3-volume series of the conceptual history of quote-unquote knowledge of the modern Enlightenment period, 2004, 2006, 2007, the Humanities, another book, The Humanities, Seen Through the Magazines, 2012, and the Cultural History series, with each volume devoted to significant decades, including, so I will just read each book, the title, Reading the Aprigol for the 1950s, Questioning the 1960s, subtitled The Cultural Politics and the Intellect of Park Chung-hee Era, and 1970 Park Chung-hee Modernism. These copious works offer not only context for reading single author and other school-oriented studies, but also posit each key period as the object of study. Her works never fail to appear in the most recognized literary scholarships, of course, so Sentimental Lee Kwang-soo, or The Thinking of Literary History Again, or Literatures That Breaks Down Literature. Those are all the single, it was published only last year alone. So she has been really changing the maps of Korean literary studies, not just changing directions within them. And as resonates from the titles of these books, Professor Kwon's publications target not only Korean literary scholarship per se, but also beyond the academia. So beyond her books, chapters, journal articles, she has also been a public intellectual whose writings have reached a larger South Korean reading public through her capacity as a designated contributor to opinion columns in Korean daily newspapers, Hangyeol Shinmun, Gyeongyang Shinmun. Those through this public presence, she, an avid advocate of wholesome reading practice, which she really emphasizes, converses with a broad reading public beyond the pale of her academic appointment. one can also see her as a teacher of the reading masses, and especially when we come across those the articles entitled "Books Selected by Professor Kwon Boduerae of Korea University" in newspapers. So her commitment to the production and sharing of the knowledge for the non-academic public masses impressed me as a very inbuilt feature of her intellectual activities. To me, to trace its origin, I wonder whether it began to take place in the activities that she began to have as a member of the group called Suyu and Beyond. This is the group that has been kind of led by the unemployed humanities and other social science scholars, and it really provided alternative critical and scholarly space for young the researchers who are not necessarily want to or could belong to academia as an establishment. And because of her activities, we can actually see that her impact is not just about the academy or the reading public, but also very much of the kind of subtle underground, the research kind of academies. But unsurprisingly, not just because of her exceptional scholarly assets, but also because of her sheer generosity, many non-Korean students of Korean literature and history have been nourished. I'm using that nourished in a very comprehensive sense. By the time they spent researching with Professor Kwon in Korea, and here are actually several also here, and I was also quite surprised to know that Deborah Smith, who gained global attention for translating Han Gang's work, The Vegetarian, The Human Acts. Also, she studied with Professor Kwon Boduerae. So behind all Professor Kwon's publications, teaching and scholarship and mass reach, I just see a very characteristically creative, principled, and the collaborative kind of energy behind it toward the kind of a betterment of the civil society as a whole. And now I would like to move to her partner in this conversation, Professor Aboul-Ela. Professor Aboul-Ela is an associate professor of English at University of Houston, where he settled after teaching English, literary theory, comparative literature in the departments both English and also Middle Eastern studies in various institutions, including Hofstra, NYU, Columbia University, and Bowling Green State University. His first book, 2007, is Other South, and you can see the kind of resonances there as opposed to North, entitled Faulkner, Coloniality, and the Mariátegui Tradition. The second book that was published last year was Domestications, subtitled Literary Culture, American Empire, and the Post-Colonial Lens. Professor Aboul-Ela is also a very accomplished translator, and just to cite one, Sonala Abrahim's novel Warda from Arabic to English will be published next year by Yale University Press, and he has been very much often kind of appearing in the NPR about the Arab situations of Arab literature. But this brief information may not help our East Asian regular audience in much rationalizing the seemingly unlikely pairing of these two professors. To make a very long and complicated story short, I would just simply note that the CEAS lecture series itself has been kind of the catalyst in bringing them together. So as many of you remember, last October, Professor Baek Nak-chung, who spoke about the candlelight revolution in South Korea, was the main CEAS lecture speaker, as Susan mentioned. And it happened that Professor Baek Nak-chung's critical writings, which is now translated by Yu Young-ju at Michigan Ann Arbor, is prepared to be published through the series called Theory in the World, which is a new series, brand new, which published the translation of a critical theory from the critical context outside of Europe and North America. And this series is co-edited by Professor Aboul-Ela and Gayatri Chakravarti-Spivak, and to be published by Siegel Press, which is distributed through the University of Chicago Press. And his passion for kind of dialogues between South and South dialogue, and especially attention to the most unrepresented kind of literary tradition, South Korean tradition, has been very very humbling. It made me very humbled because he, in fact, goes to South Korea, registered in Hagwon in Gangnam, the private institute, and he really learns Korean. Even now, he's constantly Skyping with his translator aides and all that. And his kind of reading of the Hwang Seok-young and other very reputed South Korean novelists are indeed included in his book, The Domestications, last year. And as far as I know, these two professors from very different backgrounds have long known each other, to my surprise, through Deborah Smith, but never had the chance to engage with each other in this public conversation. And to my knowledge, this public scholarly exchanges between a scholar of Arab literature and post-colonial studies based in the US and a scholar of South Korean literature based in South Korea have never really happened in the United States. So in order to make this US premiere conversation possible, Professor Kwon has graciously agreed to shorten her own talk so that we will have a more discussion space. So now please join me in welcoming Professor Kwon Boduerae to the podium and for a talk entitled Self-Determination, Representation in the March 1st Movement.
Hello. So, Professor Che's introduction of me is simply far beyond what I deserve. So, just to let me say thank you for a warm welcome. And I'd like to thank Professor Che for inviting me here today. And I also would like to thank Professor Hosam for making a long journey to Chicago and making this precious encounter to me possible. And thank you everybody for coming today in this busy season, midterm season. So, today I will be discussing the March 1st movement in Korea, an event that I'm sure you as scholars of East Asian culture and history might be familiar with. The March 1st movement, in contrast to its name, continued for 3 months in 1919, and 6.2% of the entire population participated in a series of uprisings. In other words, 1 million people out of total population of 16 million. It is a surprising number when you consider that the development of communication, the conventional restriction for social activities of minorities, as well as the political suppression at that time. To put things in more concrete terms, in the 2016 candlelight demonstration, 2 million people out of a total population of 50 million participated, which is 4%. With the exception of only 8 counties, people rose against the colonial rule across the Korean peninsula, risking injury, death, and imprisonment. This map pinpoints the locations of the uprisings during the movement, and the largest circles signifies the largest scale uprisings, which exceeded the 10,000 participants you can see there. The actual casualties, I'm not sure if it's important or not, but it's not clear. There is a great gap between the contemporaneous colonial government official report, which is 500 something, and the Korean Provisional Government Survey, which is over 7,000. This old gap has never been questioned seriously. There was a negligence to verify such a detail since there have always been more grave elements than plain facts, a sense of nationalistic solidarity. And the March 1st movement was the foremost source of such a sentiment. It is true that the March 1st movement has different appellations conveying different connotations from nationalism, such as People's Uprising in North Korea or Revolution of nowadays. At one point during the 1980s through the 1990s, it was even understood through a Marxist schema. However, overall studies have largely been limited to a nationalist framework. Strangely enough, the March 1st movement has even been left out of modernist interpretations, that is, in the construction and development of modernity in Korea. Let me add a piece of information here. The official database of the March 1st movement, I think it's a commendable achievement, began to be uploaded this year by the National Institute of Korean History. And it provisionally suggested the actual number of the dead as 994, kind of a between. So such a situation is rather peculiar when you think about the real legacy of the movement. It produced the provisional government of the presidential system. It entailed a heated longing for modern culture, and it functioned as a launchpad for women and other minorities. During the decade-long interlude between initial colonization in 1910 and the movement, people began to realize their new needs and desires, then articulated and expressed them through the movement. Just like the French Revolution's role, the March 1st movement functioned as the common public sphere, which simultaneously opened across numerous spots in Korea. The March 1st movement was a field of discussion, education, Bildung, and self-discovery. In short, it affected and embodied the modernizing process. This year, the centennial of the movement, in celebrating the centennial of the movement, we can see that the interpretational frame is decisively shifting. It is true not only within academia, but also within popular understanding. The government official slogan for the movement centennial is just like this: history that people have kept, country that people will lead. One of the TV specials for the movement was entitled The Birth of the Citizen. Such an understanding, at least, more aptly aligns with the contemporary Korean situation, especially when you consider how Koreans are proud of their achievement of democratization and civic engagement. In line with these new understandings, I'd also like to call your attention to the diversity of the March 1st movement. It was initiated by religious leaders and students in urban spaces, but it was locals and peasants who cultivated and spread it. While it had been symbolized by the manse demonstration in the marketplace during daytime, which you might be familiar with, it was also an event where people attacked the police stations, public offices, and they lighted mountain dark beacons during the night. It is famous for its adherence to the peace principle. Not a single Japanese civilian was sacrificed, and only 8 soldiers, policemen were murdered during the movement. Koreans had plenty of chances to acquire firearms, naturally, but refused to, surprisingly. Nevertheless, especially in the later part of the movement in rural areas, people often defended themselves with stones and farming tools and attacked the police stations. This nuanced complexity also applies to the tension between the voluntary versus coercive aspects of the movement. On one hand, the March First movement was an astonishing record of voluntary involvement. On the other hand, those who refused to participate were sometimes threatened with beatings, killings, and arson to their homes, a threat that was occasionally even actualized. So this leaflet from the March First movement warned that villages where people didn't organize manse demonstration would be punished by arson. It reads, 근방 각동 사람 등은 진정 불쌍하고 가엾도다. 너희 동은 국가도 모르고 벙어리가 아닌가. 어찌 대한제국 독립 만세를 부를 줄 모르난다. So something like that. So also between knowledge and ignorance, we can see certain conflicts among the participants. Even ordinary people seemed to be familiar with international politics. Even peasants, they frequently commented on the cases of Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc. Yet the same people made excuses by claiming, I don't even know the meaning of manse or independence. I was just threatened to participate. The list of such examples of conflicting aspects is somewhat endless, I think. The civil democratic interpretation of frame nowadays, as well as the nationalist understanding, fails to grasp the whole picture of the movement. I'd like to argue against many of the conventional images and ideas that we associate with the March First movement. For instance, there was no actual 태극기, the Korean national flag, used on March 1st in Seoul. Here, we can see no flag from this picture taken on March 1st in front of Deoksugung, so in Seoul. So, in my view, the refusal to use the 태극기 on the very first day of the movement reveals a kind of hesitation in using a symbol of the old Joseon dynasty, Daehan Empire. Even after people began to widely use the 태극기 in other uprisings, they also frequently included a separate flag of manse, or hybrid manse 태극기. So this is a drawing of a typical manse 태극기. People wrote phrases such as long live Korea, long live Korean independence, or long live freedom on 태극기. So which I think an attempt to supplement the 태극기 as a flag of old Joseon dynasty. The Republicanist tone in the interpretation of the March First movement is certainly meaningful. However, the rich legacies of the movement exceed such a scaffold. To better appreciate these legacies, we have to contextualize them within the contemporary socio-political issues and the vivid lives of ordinary participants. Now, I'd like to focus on practices centering around the concept of representation, and I will interweave the global context and domestic situation to suggest their relationship as one of simultaneity and correspondence rather than influence. Immediacy will be a keyword in bridging these aspects here. I'd also like to draw your attention to the immediacy between language and reality grasped by declaration or manifesto, between the present and future shaped by the utopian imagination. But today's primary focus will be the immediacy between the people and its representatives. I hope to mesh the 1910s and the contemporary situation in both global and Korean history to reconsider the concept of representation. For today's talk, only political representation, maybe. Let me bring you back to the end of World War I, 1918. So it's just etching from German painter Otto Link portraying the disaster of World War I. World War I had finally succeeded to topple the old regimes that had managed to survive the French Revolution and Napoleonic conquest in Europe. The author of Dark Continent, Professor Aboul-Ela, once stated that the year of 1789 was completed by the year of 1918 to portray such an upheaval. Empires that had long dominated the European political scene collapsed during World War I, and their old territories were to be rearranged for competing claims on those lands. This is a page from a newspaper on New Year's Day in 1915. This newspaper, 매일신보, which means daily newspaper, was sponsored by the colonial government and the only nationwide newspaper in Korea during the 1910s. Quite cleverly, this page was made to be used as a calendar for a whole year. Yeah, see? And served as a reminder of the 11 countries that were involved in the war. The Japanese emperor is located at the very top, and on his right there is a king of the UK, and left there is a Russian emperor. So, and we can see also there are kings of Austro-Hungary, Belgium, Serbia, Montenegro, and Germany and Turkey, along with presidents of France and Portugal. As you can see, in 1915, when it was published, 9 states among a total of 11 were monarchies with only 2 exceptions. When World War I ended in 1918, the situation fundamentally and drastically changed so that only 3 of these states, Japan, UK, Belgium, remained empires or monarchies. Russia, Germany, Austro-Hungary, Turkey, and Serbia had each experienced their respective revolutions, while Montenegro was annexed to the new Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia Republic. Indeed, Japan had frequently confessed to a political anxiety that they were left without any monarchical counterpart. At the same time, we can see the newborn 12 countries across Europe and Africa. So in that sense, we can understand why Koreans believed that they could make their country independent. World War I marked the beginning of a new epoch. This new age was characterized by the dismissal of the myth of the supremacy of Europe and optimism of progress, along with the beginnings of a new globality that included colonies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Democratization and decolonization were the zeitgeist in the era around World War I, partly seen through the emerging ideas and acceptance of the equality of nation-states. Against this background, the decade between 1910 and 1920 witnessed the revolutions breaking out throughout the world. The Mexico Revolution, I did not write it here. In 1910, Xinhai Revolution of China in 1911, Eastern Uprising of Ireland in 1916, along with Russia, Finland, and Germany. Riots and rebellions erupted and tenaciously persisted in these regions. They were usually a double revolution, which aimed at simultaneously accomplishing democratization and decolonization. The year of 1919, when the March 1st movement occurred, marks a special moment even in this unusual period. During the span of this extraordinary year, we had such momentous events as the Bolshevik Revolution in Hungary, a beginning of a 2-year-long revolution in Egypt, the Amritsar uprising and massacre in India, the May 1st movement in China, and perhaps symbolic of this year's gravitas, the experimental verification of Einstein's principle of relativity. And we can also witness the building of the Third International Commentary. It was within this context of serial global turbulence that the March 1st movement was situated. We can remember the Czechoslovakian case as a typical example. This is the Declaration of Independence of Czechoslovakia in 1918, and the first president, Jan Masaryk, who exchanged some knowledge with philosopher Edmund Husserl. Czechoslovakia, annexed to the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 16th century, proclaimed its right to build an independent state and revolted against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, denying the empire's ability to act their trusted sovereign. Czechoslovakians claimed that as the Austro-Hungarian Empire was nothing but an autocratic suppressor, it could not represent the people's will. Czechoslovakia was an exceptional country in that it soon realized its demand for independent sovereignty and was invited officially to the Paris Peace Conference. As a new government based on the people's will, allegedly, Czechoslovakia radically reorganized the society. Czechoslovakian government confiscated and redistributed land without compensation, implemented an 8-hour workday, and promised women's suffrage. In pursuing such great changes, Czechoslovakian people walked through the principle of self-determination. We can also remember different yet similar examples of Poland, Finland, Ireland, Croatia, and Latvia, or former colonies within Europe. By now, on the very right side, you can see Woodrow Wilson, the American contemporaneous American president. The George Clemenceau of France in middle, and Lloyd George on the right, on the left. By now, we have become acutely aware of Woodrow Wilson's coinage of the phrase self-determination, even though he did not directly speak of. It is well known that Koreans had pinned all their hopes on him, Woodrow Wilson, at the time of the March 1st movement. Meanwhile, we often ignore the fact that Lenin had already declared a similar principle even before Wilson. By way of the 1919 Karahan Manifesto, Soviet Russia had abandoned and renounced its claims to its former colonies. At the same time, we must also acknowledge that resistance efforts of weak nations such as Czechoslovakia or Poland had preceded Wilsonism. Wilson's declaration of self-determination merely helped confirm and articulate their long smoldering efforts. Nevertheless, Woodrow Wilson played a pivotal role in legitimating such efforts. The structure of U.S. hegemony, which henceforth lasted for a century before President Donald Trump, was constructed under his name. This hegemony was not the old European imperialism, but instead based on a kind of paternalism. In the Philippines, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, the U.S. identified itself as a savior for the old colonies, in this case Spain, suppressed by the people suppressed by Spain, the old colonies' sufferings, and claimed they were willing to welcome the self-liberating efforts of qualified nations. The contradictions of self-determination can perhaps best be seen in Woodrow Wilson's denial of the petition for the Philippines' autonomy as an irresponsible action. He instead suggested a mandate of gradual guided independence rather than immediate sovereignty. Now, we can clearly see that the criterion of becoming a qualified nation or qualified self for self-determination was only reserved for European nations. Without Robert Lansing, the Secretary of the State at the time, spoke more openly. Races, peoples, or communities whose state of barbarism or ignorance deprived them of the capacity to choose intelligently their political affiliations cannot claim any right to self-determination. On the other hand, the principle of self-determination presupposed a government constructed upon the consent of the governed. In particular, it raised questions regarding the representational system. In fact, the majority of Wilson's 14 points, announced in 1918, focused on manifesting the new doctrine of modern diplomacy and restructuring the concept of political representation. Points 1 through 5 are primarily preoccupied of criticizing the old idea of representation. Wilson's declaration that the age of conquest is over initiated international confusion and uncertainty. For Wilson, the official representatives of various empires did not represent the national parliament nor the majority party, but rather represented that military and imperialistic minority. Wilson then further asked, to whom have we been listening then? Only nations that would consolidate the principles of justice and world peace were allowed to proclaim themselves as an officially recognized nation. In the same manner, representatives would need to begin amending and restructuring their roles and duties in order to actualize the hopes of citizens longing for freedom and peace. In short, the self-determination required a reorganization of political systems both domestically and internationally. The March First movement embodied one of these many challenges to old value systems and hierarchies. It emerged from orthodoxness after nearly a decade of oppressive Japanese colonial rule that completely banned any kind of political or social organizations. Perhaps one of the clearest signs of the movement's success was the very famous formation of the 33 national representatives. This is a photo not of 33 national representatives, of the more expanded 48 engagers. An appellation still widely used to this very day, the 33 national representatives, refers to the individuals that signed the Korean Declaration of Independence. In fact, one of Korean Declaration of Independence. They were from 3 different religious groups, such as Cheondogyo Heavenly Way religion followers, Korean Christians, and Buddhists. But they could not be official representatives. It is true that Cheondogyo was a powerful religion with 1 million believers at least, and Christianity was also influential with 404 missionaries and 200,000 followers. But in signing the declaration, they essentially self-elected themselves as representatives of the Korean nation. That is, they bypassed any democratic process or electoral system. The Korean students who drafted the February 8th Declaration of Independence, it was presented in Tokyo 1 month prior the March 1st movement. They suggested hosting a national assembly instead of presenting themselves as representatives in order to declare independence and to form a real representative body. That might be a reasonable way. The 33 representatives, in contrast, unhesitantly claimed themselves as national representatives. At that time, there were no more than 30 different There were more than 30 different kinds of independence declaration by various groups in circulation, within and without. So 33 national representatives declaration was nothing but one of them. But those representatives were unrivaled both in terms of their resolve and certainty in acting as the Korean representatives and their popularity among the base. Koreans, just like other colonized people, were completely denied the luxury of voting and had little political rights. what essentially amounted to a voiceless existence in the political sphere. It was precisely this daring and audacity to select themselves as representatives without due process in order to transgress such colonial restriction that was the secret to igniting the nationwide movement. It was also true for individuals. We can witness numerous representatives who acted on principle of self-determination. Let me give some direct examples from the movement. The first person is Yu Bongjin, who led demonstrations in Ganghwa-do, a small island near Incheon. Yu Bongjin was a former soldier and a silversmith. Upon hearing the news of the Manse movement in Seoul, he instantly resolved to organize a Manse demonstration in Ganghwa-do. He was not even certain as to whether people shouted Manse to celebrate independence already achieved or to demand independence yet to come. It was common misunderstanding among the populace to think that Korea already achieved independence, especially in the early stages of the movement. Like many other manifestos, the first sentence of the Declaration of the Independence, we hereby proclaim the independence of Korea and the liberty of the people. 모든 자의 조선이 독립국인과 조선인의 자주민임을 선언하노라. Divide and challenged any clear-cut boundary between language and reality, present and future. As a perlocutionary act, the Declaration of the Independence was pulling the unrealized future to become the present. Despite such an uncertainty, Yu Bongjin's resolution in leading a demonstration of his own was instant and steadfast. He persuaded his friends to make plans for the protest and then went to the neighboring island to appeal to the populace to rise up in protest. It was an arduous journey that would have taken him about 10 or so hours. On March 18th, Market Day, his colleagues took the lead in initiating shouts of Manse, but he saw that the crowd was still a confused and muddled mass with no organization. Yu Bongjin first rang a large bell. It was located near the county office in order to grab people's attention. As soon as some dozens of people had gathered around, he directed them into orderly position and led them to march in a route that went from the county office, the inn, the Confucian shrine, and the police station. It's an interesting route, I think. Over the course of their protest, they threatened the county governor and demanded he shout Manse and saved some Koreans within colonial police force. Yu Bongjin managed to reprimand and deter the protesters who were demanding violent mob justice, while simultaneously convincing the police to not shoot the protesters. While giving his speech to the masses, Yu Bongjin took off his top garment and displayed his white undergarment, which had Crusader cuffs, 결사대, Kenshitai in Japanese, clearly written on it. This was a role that he had taken upon himself. He had also made a Korean national flag with the phrase Crusader Corps representative written on it. After the protest, even when Yu Bongjin began his life as a runaway, he did not lose his identity as a representative of the Crusader Corps. Under his very influence, the March First movement left a permanent trace on the lives of the Ganghwa-do residents. Among them was Cho Bong-am, who would later become the leader of the Progressive Party. He was executed in 1959 by President Lee Sung-man. He described the experience as one where I became a person that learned what a country is and what I would do for my people, and for the rest of his life would remain devoted to the lessons learned from his participation in the protest. Through the March First movement, the patriotism and enlightenment of the early 1900s were renewed and inherited. It was passed down as far as the 1950s. This is another voluntary representative, Yang Bong-shik, who was active in Chungcheong province, but I think I have to skip his case for time limit. Through all my researches, one thing has struck me as especially admirable: the voluntariness of the movement and its representative. As seen in the cases I've just discussed, many Koreans came forward on their own as representatives of certain sources of Korean society. Self-determination was inspirational for individuals as well as for nations. Koreans filled with discontent and hope for the modern world both accepted and exceeded a system of representation at the same time. Yet, this same voluntariness also gave rise to a kind of chaos, as you can guess. This chaos was evident in the inherent nature of the March First movement, a kind of street protest, street democracy, but also in revolution's wake, the afterglow of the revolutionary moment. At the time, there were numerous organizations and representatives working both within Korea and outside its borders. For instance, at one point, there were around 7 separate provisional governments. The Shanghai government was one of them, and kind of convergence, but just no more than one of them. Despite the chaos of the time, the separate actors were ultimately able to coordinate and unite for a common good by capitalizing on the March First movement's momentum. Certainly, we can see this as the inevitability of institutionalization. But we can also ask, how can we make an institution that embodies the logic of street protest and democracy? Perhaps we can see a small example through the self-governing councils in the provinces, which took over the responsibility of public administration for a few days or even weeks. It was not that many, but there were some examples. Now you can see Wilson and Lenin here. It was a time when the Soviet model was being experimented throughout the world. Soviet means council in Russian. As is well known, the Bolsheviks were distrustful and dismissive of bourgeois democracy and parliamentarism. Quite famously, in 1918, they convened the Constituent Assembly for the sole purpose of dissolving it, replacing it with the Third All-Russian Congress of Soviets. The Russian case was ultimately challenging to the liberalist parliamentarism, adding another facet to the Wilsonian attempt to reconstruct the old representational systems. Korea, with the March First movement, responded to this spectrum of attempts in its own way. They were, I believe, trying to construct their own political system within and without a representational system through their pre-modern discontent and their postmodern hope. The March First movement was one of numerous experiments in forming people's politics during the time. I believe it is precisely this spirit of chaotic and daring imagination that is one of the movement's greatest legacies, and it is our maybe duty to continue to unearth and embody these legacies in the present. For this last portion, I'd like to emphasize again the great transformation after World War I. It was a real unusual moment in world history. The liberalist system of representation had existed in European countries for over 100 years at the time, even though this parliamentarism was held as an ideal or a standard to be attained for democracy, it nevertheless hinged upon the suppression and exclusion of certain groups and minorities from political rights. The right to vote was granted only to men, as all of you know, and even then only men from wealthy social classes. Women, peasants, proletariats, and so on were long denied the right to express and realize their will for politics. An 8-hour workday, women's suffrage, decolonization, and independence, these claims of the government exploded after World War I. This was the backdrop against which Woodrow Wilson attempted to revise the concept of representation. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, sharing this problem, was more determined to refuse the representational system in general and suggested the Soviet system instead. Even though his experiment ended kind of in vain, not succeeded by Stalin. I'm not arguing that Koreans understood Wilsonism and Leninism as articulated. Nevertheless, they did understand that there was a rise in socio-political turbulence on a global scale and strived to inscribe their desires and hopes within such a situation. They acted as prophets in demanding a change from the world. Plenty of people throughout the world shouldered similar tasks. Some of them. In the spring of 1919, Paris was in full bloom with a dizzying array of people from across the world. There were those that came to Paris through unofficial means, through a process of self-selection and sheer determination to have their voices heard. Traversing both literal and metaphorical oceans of distance to arrive at Paris, these self-selected representatives were active for their nation or race's liberation. Although the majority of Latin America after the Haitian Revolution had been independent since the early 19th century, the national liberation movements in Africa and Asia only began to gain momentum in the 20th century. A crucial component of this momentum was the animated discussions surrounding representation and its reconstitution. This is a photograph of representatives attended to the Black Congress in 1919 Paris. It was organized by Professor Du Bois, so on left side, and to invite over 50 self-selected Black representatives. One of them was Blaise Diagne, later the first president of Senegal, so who was an adopted son of a foreign missionary, just like Kim Gyu-sik, Korean representative, and who conscripted the Senegalese, just like Gandhi for Indians, for France during World War I. I would also like to add cases of Kim Gyu-sik and Ho Chi Minh, who were active as national representatives at the Paris Peace Conference. Needless to say, you can see various groups and organizations appointed their own representatives to dispatch them to the conference, like Korean Society in the US, Korean Society in Russia, or female students, or Confucianists, even Tangun religion. Here we can see Kim Gyu-sik, the so-called Korean representative, but actually he was the only one who safely arrived in time at Paris. The other Korean representatives failed in arriving in Paris by the time, but Kim Gyu-sik succeeded. At the center, you can see Ho Chi Minh, who stayed in Paris at that time, and who tried to meet President Wilson. And on the right side, you can see two official Chinese delegates, Wellington Gu and Lu Zhongshan. So their interaction among them is another story. So maybe it's a story about other representatives, but I think it's a kind of live time, so I will leave this for another time. So, yeah, thank you.
Well, so I'm gonna try to sort of tease out some points that were important to me about the talk, and talk a little bit about theoretical, methodological significance of Professor Kwon's research. And then I'm going to pose a few questions to her, and then I'll throw it open for all of us to have a conversation. I'll try not to go on too long, but Professor Che asked me to kind of like emphasize a few things, and so I'll force you to listen to me for a second. Let me quickly thank Professor Che for inviting me, and Connie Yip for being great with all the logistics. And you thanked me for coming such a long way, but you came much further, and you gave a much more substantive talk than my remarks. I should address something right off the bat. When we were having dinner last night, then my colleagues were saying, why on earth did you ever take up the study of the Korean Peninsula and become interested in Korean literature and Korean thinkers? So I feel like I should say something about that as a way of getting into the substance of the talk. So I'm coming out of post-colonial studies and trained in a comparative literature program. And the inspiration for most of my work is the Palestinian-American scholar Edward Said, who was at Columbia University for many years and who is become now a foundational figure in comparative literary studies in the US, and who, by the way, was a student at the same time that Paik Nok Chong was at Harvard. They were both graduate students at Harvard together. So in Edward Said's work, the work that people associate him with most directly is Orientalism, his study Orientalism, which came out in 1978, and which was a study that focused explicitly on European representations of really Islamicate cultures. He didn't really go any further east than the Arab Middle East. He, over the course of 15 or 20 years, began to sort of revise the arguments that he made in Orientalism, gradually revise the arguments he made in Orientalism in several important ways. And that process culminated in his book Culture and Imperialism, which came out in the mid-90s. And is in some ways, for some reason, not as influential as his earlier work, even though if you kind of systematically look at Said's work and put it in other contexts and think of it in terms of comparative studies of the global South, I think that you find that work has a lot of important, has a kind of significance for where we are in the current moment in literary studies that goes beyond the earlier work. And there's one thing in particular that comes up there, which is that he takes on the challenge of trying to at least address cultures of resistance as part of the discussion of colonization as a kind of a force that globalized culture and that forced us to think globally whenever we think of different cultures, whether literary or whether social histories. So in doing that, he began to kind of provoke the possibility of a comparative studies that thinks about cultures of resistance. Okay, and so this is brings me to Professor Kwon's research on the March 1st movement and my particular interest in the way she's emphasizing the kind of aspects of it that are not only kind of specific, rigorously researched resistance culture in one particular location, but also thinking of that in terms of simultaneity and in terms of global comparison. So what does the March 1st movement have to do with the Egyptian Waft movement that starts in the same year, and how does Wilson's idea of self-determination and Lenin's critique of imperialism connect those two movements? The work of Mariátegui in South America, the work of other liberation thinkers. This is something that, like, I've been thinking for many years, and I've been writing about the kind of question of resistance cultures as a way of entering into thinking of literature, thinking of global literatures comparatively, but I really can't think, this is the first piece of research that really kind of pushes it back to the early part of the century in a way that I find very helpful. There's another question, and I want to kind of move toward discussing the way representation is talked about in the paper. And I think we all want to keep in mind also that the paper is a kind of summary of a very long, very heavily documented and well-researched book. So the more we can use this time to kind of get more more data and more details from the research that's been done out of that, then the better off we are. So with respect to the question of representation, again, Professor Jay mentioned that I've been working with Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak, and if you kind of go back to the roots of post-colonial studies, you see that this issue of representation is very foundational to the way we talk about these things in the United States. And where Professor Spivak has been going lately with this is, again, to questions of comparative studies and global comparativism. And I think for anyone in the East Asian Studies program or department, this would be an issue of concern. I think that the provocation that she's trying to hit in almost all her public appearances and writing lately is this provocation that has to do with specialization versus versus a comparative global approach. And so one way to think of this issue is sort of when you go and decide that Korean literary culture is important for your work because you're working on U.S. hegemony as a frame to think about a new comparative literature. Immediately what you find yourself confronting is a disciplinary tradition that insists that you become a Koreanist before you say anything about Korea. So this is Professor Spivak's kind of challenge that she's brought up. Is how do you have sort of the rigor of an area studies specialist in your work? At the same time, you don't follow a kind of path toward becoming an area studies specialist that makes you accept a lot of political presumptions that we feel like we've moved beyond in our literary studies. So trying to kind of strike a balance between thinking of new points of connection and new sorts of criticism that move us beyond the idea that only Europe is global and Europe is the only place in the world that can't be compared, to one that includes emphasis on documentary research and knowledge of languages and specific area knowledge, but is thinking of that area knowledge in global terms. Right? So again, the way in which Professor Kwon's paper talked about cultures of resistance would be one example of that. The other is in this question of representation, right? I think that all the different movements that she mentioned are movements that are struggling with representation. And the kind of connection between the need for representatives as a way to make a social movement sustainable, and the need to sort of keep the momentum of the mass participation that your statistics and your data show as well. I'm going to deviate from the notes that I wrote out and ask you to talk a little bit about representation. My specific question about that is, goes back to the question of literature and literary studies. Because this public conversation that we're having now, I should admit to everyone, is an extension of like a series of conversations that were happening in coffee shops around Korea University. I need to make an admission, which is that until this weekend, I had presumed that the question of representation in this research was all about literary representation. And so I was very interested to kind of like see in the talk this systematic discussion of representation as a political question, the question of political representation. So I want to start my questioning by asking if you could talk a little bit more about the role of representation in the research, and maybe say something about how you see political representation and literary representation as distinctive, and how in the larger work maybe you talk about literary representation as a kind of like afterlife of the March 1st movement.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Hosam. So the question of representation is quite a serious one here. So we can clearly remember that Edward Said posed the problem of representation of the self and the other, and while Guiter Spivak juxtaposed the political representation of kind of speaking for and cultural representation of portraying. And at the same time, you just suggested that to overcome the representation by other or by Eurocentric viewpoint, we have to collaborate each other. So we have to cross the borders to question the global kind of European or American-centered standard of comparison. So in such a way, I think I don't have a real thing to respond to your question, because my book and my research about the March 1st movement is not about the cultural representation. It is true that, so I wrote some about the literary representation of the March 1st movement, like the representation of the afterlife of the March 1st movement, actually the March 1st generation. But I think it's a different, separate issue here. So for the political representation, it was a real issue through the March 1st movement. So who will be the representative and who can be, and what is the aim of these political activities? That was a heated question. What kind of cultural representation of Koreans were not that in question? But at the same time, we can ask a question. I'd like to raise a question about the representation of the March 1st movement itself, if you allow. The March 1st movement has been long represented as a nationalist event. So as a natural result, it has ignored the existence of minorities and vivid individuals. So in fact, it was really hard to trace. The lives of the real participants in the March 1st movement. So I'm thinking. So I have been thinking about the representation of the March 1st movement in kind of at national scale, so not that international or cross-border scale. But now I can think that why I tried to, without any real motivation, I tried to compare Korean case to Egyptian case or Czechoslovakian case. And so what I aimed to. So that's a topic that we have to discuss together. So I have been always curious why you are interested in Korean case, even though you already answered. So by juxtaposing a variety of examples, neighboring examples, and maybe and define the monopolizing desire of one's self-representation. And so I think it could be a way of having dialogue with other lives or other possibility of representations. It's quite out of the issue of representation. It's like more living together. If you can add something, and then I will quit.
So I guess the other thing that I was thinking about is that, thinking about representation together with this category of cultures of resistance, and trying to think, okay, if you want to have a comparative studies that looks at, you mentioned the kind of the Latin American example, okay, like they became independent in the 1800s, but there was intellectually, I saw in your PowerPoint from Saturday, you were talking about Amalta, which was a Mariátegui journal, and so intellectually in the early 19th century, then the issue of commerce from the North Atlantic, and especially from the Anglophone North Atlantic, started to look to them like a kind of new imperialism in Latin America. And that was a way in which certain Latin American intellectuals started writing about their problems, similarly to Du Bois and the people that were in Paris, and to the Egyptians, and to the resistance in this so-called Arab awakening that arose in the aftermath of World War I. But what ends up happening in a kind of disciplinary context, I think, is that you end up like it's so much easier to kind of look at all these movements as isolated movements that are happening in different parts of the world, and that their connection to one another is just sort of ad hoc, right? And so that part of your talk, I thought, seemed really interesting and really important. Also related to this, in terms of how we represent the history of social change, is the place of the United States, right? So if you look at Edward Said's work, then he's always saying, okay, I'm writing about England and France, and because they were the biggest colonies in my period, which is the 19th and early 20th century. But I'm really thinking all the time of the United States and the United States' role in the world, especially after World War II. So when I decided that I wanted to do something that focused directly on that, because he was saying in almost every work, oh, this is what we should be focusing on, but then everybody, many people who were influenced by him just went back to the British and French colonialism, right, and ignored the US side of it. So when I decided I wanted to do something that was sort of like, flagrantly doing what everybody else wasn't doing in that way, I started with the end of World War II. So the other thing I learned from your talk is that there's a lot of potential for pushing that discussion back earlier and thinking about the origins of the specific US style of hegemony that became really important in the United States much earlier than the end of World War II, right? So, yeah, so that would be another question, is like, do you think that, like, is it possible to study colonial Korea and ignore the US role in it, or how important is thinking about the US as part of the culture of the era and the specific era and the places that you study?
Now I am researching on the Cold War era, so the role of the US is really important. But let me go back to the question of representation and language at the same time, to the problem of the kind of political relationship between the old empire colony model and the new still empire colony model or semi-colony model. So for representation and language, I think there might be only possibility of defining such a limit of representation as kind of dialogue. It's a real simple way, but kind of endless critic dialogue between existences could be the best way to define and kind of monopolization of representation or violence of that any representation can entail. And at the same time, the United States, the US hegemony is, I think it's a lot different from old Europe's hegemony. That after the American-Spanish War in 1898, so the US began to gain the dominance over the world by claiming their role as a paternal guardian. So actually they liberated, well, how can I say, but Hawaii became one part of the US in 1952. And you know the situation of the Philippines and Puerto Rico nowadays, right? So for cultural representation, we can say that there have never been a real significant difference between the old imperial colony relationship and the new empire and colony relationship. But I don't know, in the old system, in all the representational system, it was kind of mirror relationship of the self and the other. But for the new US-centered global order, it's not that kind of, I think, yeah. So even the semi-colonial, okay, let me just call them semi-colonial people. Even the semi-colonial people was acknowledged of their right to desire the equal development as the modernization theory symbolizes. And at the same time, the US did not portray them as, yeah, let me stop here. And then, yeah, if you could add something, I will ask you something too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing I would want to add is that it seems like there's this way in which ideas play this really important role for the United States in its kind of hegemonic push in a way that they did much less with the British and French empires. There's a kind of like sense of, you know, this like just the proposition of self-determination I'm thinking of. Right?
But US-centered universe is the kind of more flattened one, like that. Yeah, a lot.
Well, and at the level of idea.
Yeah, at the level
right.
of idea,
Yeah.
I think, right.
Yeah.
But that's a real difference in kind of ideological way. So in all the European imperialism, the world was kind of divided into different parts, like so. But but the United States started its hegemony by claiming the equal rights among nation states, and that foregrounded a certain possibility for newborn or reborn countries, but at the same time, the violence or the dominance of the empire began to be more complicated and kind of deeply rooted. Nowadays, we are confronting how to make the situation different. So, yeah.
I think we should just give a quick round of